January 12, 1945. A bitter wind swept across the snow-laden fields of a remote Allied POW camp in western Germany. The sky was a dull iron gray, heavy with the promise of another frigid night. Smoke curled lazily from the makeshift stacks of Nazi uniforms, each garment crisp with the memory of loyalty, discipline, and fear. A group of women, their faces pale and drawn from weeks of uncertainty, stood huddled at a safe distance. Their hands trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what they were being asked to do. Each uniform they carried bore the insignia of an ideology that had defined their lives, dictated their duties, and in some cases, demanded their obedience to orders they would later question. The sound of flint striking steel, the crackle of flames, and the murmur of hesitant voices filled the camp. Some women stared silently at the fire, while others averted their gaze, struggling to reconcile the liberation they had awaited with the humiliation it demanded. The first coat hit the flames. Smoke rose, carrying away more than fabric. It carried away an identity. The moment was quiet, yet its echoes would stretch far beyond the camp, touching memory, history, and conscience alike. By late 1944, Europe was a continent in upheaval. The Third Reich, once the seemingly unstoppable force of Nazi Germany, was crumbling under the relentless advance of Allied forces from the west and the Soviet Red Army from the east. Cities lay in ruins, communication lines were fractured, and the infrastructure that had supported the Nazi war machine was disintegrating. In this climate of chaos, ordinary citizens, and many who had previously served the regime, found themselves caught between loyalty and survival. Among them were German women, many of whom had been active in organizations linked to the Nazi Party, auxiliary services, or logistical support roles. Women had been mobilized in unprecedented ways during the war. Some served in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, League of German Girls, transmitting messages, managing supply depots, or performing clerical duties for the military. Others worked as auxiliaries within the Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, or even the notorious SS support structures. These roles were often framed as patriotic duties, part of the war effort, and indoctrinated from youth with the ideals of obedience and national loyalty. Yet as Allied armies advanced, the line between participant, bystander, and prisoner blurred. For the Allies, capturing female personnel was not unusual, but raised unique challenges. The presence of women among POWs complicated camp logistics and demanded careful handling. Unlike male soldiers who had been trained for combat, many of these women had been trained for organizational or administrative roles, yet they carried the same ideological markings, the symbols, uniforms, and paperwork that tied them to the machinery of the Nazi state. Their uniforms were more than clothing. They were emblems of authority, instruments of propaganda, and, for the Allies, potential evidence. Allied forces faced questions of both security and morality. How should these women be treated? What role did indoctrination play in their participation? Could uniforms, insignia, and personal items be destroyed without violating principles of humane treatment? It was within this ethical and operational framework that the order to burn the uniforms was issued. The decision was not arbitrary. It was tactical, psychological, and symbolic, designed to sever the link between allegiance and obedience. As the Allies progressed deeper into Germany, POW camps for women began to swell. Many of the detainees had been captured during retreats in regions such as the Rhineland, Saxony, and Bavaria. Military records indicate that thousands of women were held temporarily in facilities under British, American, and French jurisdiction, awaiting interrogation or reassignment. Reports from officers describe a mixture of defiance, fear, and uncertainty among the prisoners. Some attempted to cling to the last vestiges of their uniforms, stitching insignia back into place or tucking badges into secret pockets. Others had begun to internalize the shift in power, understanding that the symbols they had worn were now instruments of their own vulnerability. Within the camps, the presence of uniforms created tension. Officers observed that the garments themselves seemed to foster lingering loyalty to a defeated regime. They were visual reminders of orders once followed without question, rituals performed with meticulous care, and an ideology that demanded unwavering adherence. The uniform's destruction was conceived as both a practical measure, preventing their reuse or symbolic rallying, and a psychological intervention. By removing these markers of identity, the Allies sought to break the hold of indoctrination, to confront the prisoners with the reality of defeat, and to begin the slow work of reintegration into a post-Nazi Germany. Yet even as the Allies planned these actions, they understood the human cost. Contemporary reports note the visible distress among women forced to handle their uniforms prior to the flames. Hesitation was common. Some wept quietly. Others stared with a blank, almost stunned expression. The camp officers, many of whom had experienced years of war themselves, approached the task with measured discipline, ensuring that orders were carried out, but that the prisoners' basic dignity was maintained. These moments, while small in scale compared to the battles raging across Europe, reflected the broader collapse of the Nazi system. Authority that had once seemed absolute was now conditional, mediated by the hands of those who had once been subordinates or victims. For the women POWs, the act of burning a uniform was a confrontation with their own history, the consequences of ideology, and the emerging reality of liberation. The destruction of these garments was, in effect, the first tangible sign of a world being reordered. It foreshadowed the complex challenges of post-war reconstruction, the balance between justice and humanity, the management of former collaborators, and the psychological reckoning demanded of a population that had been steeped in totalitarian indoctrination. In these small, controlled actions within the camp, one could witness the interplay of history, strategy, and human emotion, setting the stage for the defining moments that would follow as uniforms were cast into fire. The experiences of the women and the symbolic burning of uniforms lead naturally into Section 2 of Context, which will cover POW camp protocols, the official rationale for destroying uniforms, and the broader psychological impact of these orders. By early 1945, the Allied Command had formalized procedures for handling female POWs. The Geneva Conventions provided guidance, but the reality on the ground required adjustments. Women captured in military zones were classified according to their roles: combatant, auxiliary, or administrative, and their treatment was designed to minimize risk while respecting international law. Allied officers quickly recognized that uniforms were more than practical clothing. They were symbols of authority and ideological commitment. Orders were issued across the camps. All Nazi-affiliated uniforms, insignia, and regalia were to be collected and destroyed. The purpose was twofold. Practically, it prevented the reuse of materials in potential resistance activities or espionage. Psychologically, it forced prisoners to confront the tangible loss of identity that had been intertwined with the Nazi regime. Destroying these symbols was intended to disrupt loyalty, weaken the hold of propaganda, and assert the authority of the liberating forces. The process was meticulous. Uniforms were gathered in stacks, examined by camp officers, and prepared for incineration in controlled burn pits. Camp reports note the deliberate pacing of the ritual. Prisoners were instructed to place each uniform in the flames themselves. It was an intentional act, designed to produce reflection and internalization. Witness accounts describe women hesitating, fingers shaking, eyes fixed on the burning garments. Some mumbled short prayers. Others whispered to their neighbors, seeking comfort in shared fear. The scene was a mixture of liberation and trauma. For many prisoners, the uniforms had been more than clothing. They were a daily reminder of structure, purpose, and belonging. Losing them represented a rupture in continuity, a sudden absence of the roles they had inhabited for years. Historians have observed that the act of burning the uniforms was a psychological turning point for the women. The flames consumed more than fabric. They consumed a version of themselves shaped by ideology, duty, and indoctrination. Allied officers approached this process with both firmness and caution. They were acutely aware that while the uniforms were symbols of a defeated ideology, the women were human beings confronting humiliation and fear. Logs from British and American camps describe efforts to maintain order and dignity. Groups were led calmly to the burn pits, officers spoke in measured tones, and guards ensured that no physical abuse occurred. The act was framed as both a necessary procedure and a teaching moment, reinforcing the shift in power dynamics while highlighting the moral authority of the liberators. The broader context of these actions reflects the unique challenges of the closing months of the European conflict. The Third Reich's collapse was not instantaneous, Pockets of resistance persisted, and ideological loyalty ran deep. Women POWs, many indoctrinated from adolescence, embodied the persistence of this ideology. By enforcing the destruction of uniforms, the Allies confronted not only the external threat of organized opposition, but also the internal struggle of breaking entrenched beliefs. It was also a matter of historical record-keeping. Officers documented the uniforms destroyed, the number of prisoners involved, and the psychological responses observed. These records later became valuable evidence for post-war tribunals, illustrating both the reach of Nazi ideology and the effectiveness of Allied procedures in de-escalating symbols of militarized loyalty. Ultimately, the burning of Nazi uniforms in POW camps was a small but potent gesture. It marked the tangible beginning of liberation, not just from military defeat, but from the ideological chains that had bound so many to a regime now disintegrating. And in the eyes of the women standing before the flames, the moment was both an end and a beginning, a confrontation with the past and a reluctant step toward a future free from the uniforms that had defined them. From here, the story naturally transitions into the different angles of this event, the human, tactical, psychological, and moral dimensions that illuminate the complex consequences of this act. For the women POWs, the moment of burning their Nazi uniforms was deeply personal. These garments had been sewn tightly with the threads of identity, loyalty, and routine. Some had worn them for years, performing duties they believed were honorable, participating in war efforts dictated by ideology rather than choice. The fire consumed not only fabric but the symbols of a world that had given structure and meaning to their daily lives. Accounts from camp observers describe hesitation so profound it slowed the process. A young woman, perhaps barely 18, clutched the collar of her uniform, tears freezing on her cheeks. Another whispered fragments of a song from her youth, an unconscious attempt to reclaim comfort amid the ritual destruction. The human response varied. Fear, shame, relief, and even defiance coexisted in a fragile, uneasy equilibrium. For some, watching the flames rise became a form of involuntary confession, a silent acknowledgement of past loyalty and the recognition of its consequences. Yet there was also a subtle thread of liberation. In relinquishing the uniform, these women were physically shedding the visual symbols of indoctrination. Though emotionally wrenching, it marked the first step toward autonomy. In a strange paradox, the fire that destroyed their past simultaneously illuminated the possibility of self-determination in a world suddenly beyond Nazi control. From the perspective of Allied military command, the destruction of Nazi uniforms was a calculated tactic. Uniforms were more than clothing. They were a form of identification, a tool of propaganda, and a potential security risk. Captured uniforms could be used by insurgent groups or individuals attempting to infiltrate Allied positions. By eliminating these items, officers removed a tangible element of operational risk. Moreover, the ritualized burning served as an instrument of psychological warfare. It signaled to prisoners that the authority they had once recognized was now irrevocably broken. In military terms, the Allies were not simply administering punishment. They were destabilizing loyalty, breaking the cohesion of ideological adherence, and asserting the finality of defeat. Camp reports frequently note the efficiency with which order was maintained, the careful organization of groups for the burn, and the controlled manner in which officers facilitated the process. This precision mirrored battlefield discipline, emphasizing that even in moments of symbolic destruction, military order remained paramount. Uniform destruction also provided intelligence benefits. Officers could inspect insignia, rank badges, and other identifying symbols before the flames consumed them, cataloging the roles women had occupied within Nazi structures. This data informed post-war processing, trials, and the broader understanding of the Third Reich's administrative machinery. Nazi uniforms were carefully regulated. Each rank, insignia, and garment style was part of a complex organizational system designed to reinforce hierarchy and obedience. For Allied officers, understanding this system was essential. Before uniforms were destroyed, meticulous notes were made, photographs taken in some cases, and badges cataloged. This attention to detail reflected a broader Allied strategy of documentation, crucial for post-war intelligence and historical accuracy. The uniforms themselves were technologically significant. Many contained specialized materials for field durability, weather resistance, or military function. Some badges, armbands, or epaulets carried coded information about the wearer's department, seniority, or unit. By examining and then destroying these items, the Allies simultaneously neutralized potential threats and captured insights into the inner workings of Nazi administration. This approach underscored a central principle of Allied operations. Warfare extended beyond the battlefield. Every object, no matter how mundane it seemed, could carry strategic importance. In the controlled destruction of the uniforms, officers enacted a microcosm of the larger war effort, a combination of intelligence gathering, risk mitigation, and psychological management, all intertwined in a single, deliberate act. These three angles, human, tactical, and technological, illuminate the layered complexity of what might otherwise appear to be a simple act: burning a uniform. The scene, simultaneously intimate and calculated, reveals the intersection of personal trauma, military strategy, and the meticulous systems that defined both the Nazi regime and its Allied dismantling. From here, we can explore additional perspectives and angles, Section 2, including leadership, enemy psychological impact, and moral ethical considerations, which deepen our understanding of the broader consequences of this act. The role of leadership within the POW camps was crucial in managing both the process of uniform destruction and the broader welfare of the prisoners. Allied officers faced a delicate balance. They needed to enforce orders decisively yet avoid unnecessary humiliation or cruelty. Officers' leadership was exercised through calm authority, clear instructions, and a structured approach that minimized chaos. Reports describe officers standing apart from the flames, observing closely while allowing prisoners to participate in the destruction. Their presence communicated control, while their restraint conveyed a sense of moral responsibility. Senior camp officials often briefed junior officers on the importance of maintaining dignity, ensuring that the act of burning a uniform did not become a spectacle of degradation. In this context, leadership was not only about maintaining order, it was about guiding a psychologically complex process to its intended purpose. Effective leadership also extended to handling prisoners' resistance. Some women initially refused to approach the fire, their hesitation interpreted as defiance or fear. Officers were trained to respond with patience, allowing time for reflection and encouraging compliance without physical coercion. The ability to navigate these moments reflected a broader wartime principle. Authority that combined discipline with humanity could achieve outcomes that raw force alone could not. The burning of Nazi uniforms carried profound psychological significance for both the prisoners and the Allies. To the women, each garment represented years of indoctrination, loyalty, and identity. The flames served as an unmistakable signal that the regime they had served was irrevocably defeated. For many, the act was disorienting, liberation intertwined with shame, and relief with loss. From the Allies' perspective, the destruction of uniforms was a psychological tactic aimed at eroding residual loyalty and ideological adherence. By removing the symbols of authority, the Allies sought to diminish the prisoners' psychological attachment to the Nazi Party. Contemporary reports note that after witnessing the burn, many women exhibited signs of cognitive dissonance, hesitation, silence, and subtle gestures of internal conflict. This psychological impact extended beyond the individual. The collective act created an environment in which prisoners confronted both personal and communal reckoning. Witnessing others release the same symbols into flames reinforced the finality of defeat. The uniform, once a marker of hierarchy and obedience, became a shared emblem of lost ideology and the opportunity for personal reinvention. The morality of ordering prisoners to destroy their own uniforms was not universally accepted, even among Allied officers. While the action was legally permissible under the Geneva Conventions, some officers questioned whether compelling such participation bordered on psychological coercion. The debate centered on the tension between justice and humanity. The women had served a regime responsible for atrocities, yet they were not active combatants, and many had acted under indoctrination rather than free will. Despite these concerns, the Allies justified the destruction of uniforms as a necessary and measured act. It was not intended as punishment but as a symbolic intervention, a method to sever ties to a discredited regime, diminish the risk of future insurrection, and facilitate reintegration into a post-war society. Ethical guidance emphasized restraint. Prisoners were never physically forced, verbal instructions were measured, and observers were instructed to respect personal dignity whenever possible. Historians have since analyzed this moment as a moral crossroads, highlighting the nuanced approach the Allies took. The act was simultaneously pragmatic and symbolic, blending strategy with a conscientious effort to avoid unnecessary cruelty. By framing uniform destruction as both a practical and ethical decision, Allied leadership navigated one of the war's quieter, yet deeply significant moral challenges. It was January 15, 1945, when the event that would linger in memory and history unfolded. The camp's central yard was lined with piles of uniforms, each stacked neatly, awaiting the inevitable flames. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the acrid tang of smoke from the first fires already ignited by the guards. The women, now gathered in small groups, held their coats and insignia close to their chests, reluctant to release them, yet unable to resist the orders of the Allied officers. The first uniform was placed into the fire. Flames licked the fabric, curling around the embroidered eagle and the swastika armband before reducing them to blackened ash. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. A young woman's lips trembled, a whisper of protest or prayer. No one could tell which. Another pressed her hands together as if in silent confession, while a third turned away entirely, her face pressed against a fellow prisoner's shoulder. The sound of the fire crackling, the sharp report of leather and metal igniting, and the murmured sobs created a surreal symphony of destruction and release. Officers watched quietly, their posture rigid, yet not devoid of empathy. Each step was calculated. The women were encouraged to approach the flames one by one, to place their own uniforms into the fire. Some hesitated for minutes, eyes locked on the consuming blaze, before a gentle hand guided them forward. The act was slow, deliberate, almost ritualistic. It was as if the very process of releasing the garments into the flames was designed to mirror the collapse of the ideology that had given them purpose. The psychological tension was palpable. Observers noted that many of the women initially tried to remove insignia or fold their garments as if to save something of themselves. But the fire accepted all: epaulets, armbands, collars, and caps. Ashes began to accumulate, a gray mound representing the dissolution of authority and obedience. For some, the act provoked visible panic, for others a numbed stillness. And yet, as each uniform disappeared, there was also a subtle, almost imperceptible relief, a recognition that the world had shifted irreversibly. In these moments, history and humanity intersected. The fire did not discriminate. It consumed symbols, but it also consumed memory, identity, and the illusions of invincibility once projected by the Third Reich. Contemporary camp reports describe the gradual change in demeanor among the prisoners. Shoulders straightened, hesitant glances were exchanged, and in rare instances a small, almost imperceptible nod accompanied the release of the next uniform. These gestures, subtle yet profound, indicated the beginning of acceptance, not of what had been done, but of the new reality that now surrounded them. Witness accounts also highlight the role of collective experience. Women observing each other's participation seemed to draw courage or consolation from the shared act. Resistance faded, replaced by an understanding that compliance did not signify submission but survival, and perhaps the first step toward personal reckoning. The process was as much a social exercise as it was psychological. By placing the uniforms into the fire, the prisoners collectively acknowledged the end of a system that had governed their lives for years. Allied officers recorded the sequence meticulously. Each group was logged, each uniform counted before destruction, and every reaction noted for future reports. These records would later serve as documentation of the effectiveness of the symbolic act, how it managed ideological dismantling, reduced risk, and facilitated humane treatment. From a purely operational standpoint, the uniform burning exercise was a success. From a human standpoint, it was a confrontation with the inner self, a moment when fear, shame, and relief intertwined in a stark, unforgettable tableau. As the fire consumed the final garments, the yard fell into a tense quiet. Smoke rose in long tendrils, dark against the pale winter sky, carrying with it both the remnants of the past and the seeds of a new, uncertain future. For the women, the ritual was over, but the reverberations would endure. The act of standing before the flames, of relinquishing the uniform that had defined them, had crystallized a moment in which ideology, obedience, and identity collided. It was a turning point not only for the prisoners but for the Allied officers who witnessed it, a profound demonstration of the power of symbols and the human capacity to endure both loss and liberation. The moment demanded reflection, for it was both an ending and a beginning, and it would naturally lead into the broader consequences that followed. The aftermath of the destruction, its impact on morale, and the lessons that extended far beyond the confines of the camp. As the flames consumed the final uniforms, a subtle shift rippled through the camp. The act that had begun as a rigid procedure became a quiet reckoning. Officers noted that the women, initially rigid and fearful, now exhibited a range of emotions: stunned relief, muted grief, and in some cases tentative pride in having endured the ritual. The fire had done more than destroy fabric. It had punctuated the collapse of an entire system of loyalty and obedience. The immediate impact on camp morale was profound. Among the female prisoners, tension began to ease, replaced by a cautious curiosity about life beyond the boundaries of indoctrination. Observers recorded whispered conversations about family, hometowns, and the possibility of returning to a world no longer ruled by Nazi authority. For some, the act of burning the uniforms was the first time they had experienced autonomy in years. The ritual provided not only a symbolic severing of past allegiances, but also an implicit affirmation of their status as liberated individuals. For the Allied officers, the event validated the careful balance they had sought to achieve between discipline and humanity. Commanders recognized that the ritual's design, ordered, controlled, yet respectful, had minimized resistance while maximizing psychological impact. Unlike punitive measures or coercion, this approach allowed prisoners to participate voluntarily in their own ideological transition. The uniform burning exercise became a case study in psychological management, illustrating how authority could be asserted without unnecessary cruelty. The destruction of the uniforms also carried broader ideological implications. Within the confines of the camp, the collapse of Nazi symbols was tangible evidence of the Third Reich's vulnerability. The insignia, epaulets, and badges that had once conferred status and purpose were now ash, and with them the visual markers of hierarchy, discipline, and loyalty evaporated. Officers noted that the absence of these symbols reduced residual authority among the prisoners, diminishing the likelihood of collective defiance or organized opposition. Some women exhibited more complex reactions. A few lingered near the smoke, transfixed by the dancing flames as though attempting to extract meaning from their disappearance. Others conversed quietly with each other, debating what the uniforms had represented, how much of their identity had been entwined with the ideology, and what survival now demanded. Camp reports highlight these reflections as evidence of a cognitive shift. Prisoners were beginning to separate themselves from the structures that had previously defined them. The broader significance extended beyond the camp itself. Allied intelligence officers understood that the act had consequences for post-war reconstruction, for historical accountability, and for reintegration into society. The meticulous documentation of uniforms destroyed, roles held, and prisoners' reactions became part of the historical record. This information later informed tribunals, denazification policies, and sociological studies of ideological indoctrination. By reducing the power of symbols, the Allies had initiated a form of controlled deprogramming, a psychological preparation for life after totalitarianism. Yet, for all its strategic and psychological impact, the scene retained a deeply human dimension. Officers recalled that after the burn, some prisoners paused by the ashes, fingers tracing the blackened remnants as if saying goodbye. Tears were common, yet laughter, quiet, almost imperceptible, also appeared among small groups. Relief mingled with guilt, grief with hope. The fire had consumed a past that could not be reclaimed, but it had also illuminated the possibility of a future defined not by uniforms or ideology, but by choice. As night fell over the camp, the yard lay quiet, scarred by ash and smoke. The women, now unburdened of the symbols of their former allegiance, walked slowly back to their quarters. Officers observed, taking note of demeanor, interactions, and the subtle recalibration of power within the camp. The act of burning uniforms had been both an ending and a beginning, an ending of symbolic authority and ideological cohesion, and a beginning of personal reflection, psychological adaptation, and the slow process of post-war liberation. In this way, the ritual of the fire became a microcosm of Europe itself, a continent emerging from the ashes of totalitarianism, confronting the remnants of ideology, and slowly stepping toward a future where freedom, accountability, and human dignity could coexist. The moment demanded reflection, and its consequences naturally lead into the aftermath, where the long-term effects on the prisoners, the camps, and historical memory can be traced. The morning after the uniform burn, the camp carried a different weight. The ashes had cooled, but their significance lingered in the eyes and movements of the women. Officers reported a quieter, more subdued atmosphere, marked by tentative conversations and cautious observation. The act of destroying the uniforms had achieved its immediate purpose. The visible markers of loyalty, hierarchy, and ideological adherence were gone, replaced by a landscape of reflection and uncertain freedom. For the prisoners themselves, reactions varied. Some women experienced relief, interpreting the loss of uniforms as liberation from obligations they had previously accepted without question. Others wrestled with guilt or confusion, uncertain how to reconcile participation in the Nazi system with the stark realities of defeat. Camp logs describe small groups lingering near the burn pits, tracing their fingers through the gray ashes or holding discarded insignia close to their chests. These were private rituals of remembrance and reckoning, moments where past identity collided with a new, uncharted existence. The aftermath also revealed subtle shifts in interpersonal dynamics. Women who had once aligned themselves with senior or influential peers found that authority had dissipated with the uniforms. Hierarchies based on rank, role, or perceived loyalty melted away, replaced by interactions guided more by survival and shared experience than ideology. Officers noted that cooperation and compliance increased significantly once the fire had consumed the symbols of power. Even small acts, offering food, helping neighbors with clothing, or sharing blankets, were marked by a newfound egalitarianism born from collective vulnerability. From the perspective of Allied officers, the ritual reinforced the importance of symbolic acts in psychological management. By destroying uniforms, they had addressed both security and moral concerns. Captured materials could no longer be used for propaganda or infiltration, and the prisoners had been confronted with the consequences of past allegiance in a controlled, humane environment. This careful balance between authority and respect was a hallmark of effective leadership, demonstrating that the Allies understood the value of psychological as well as physical control. Official reports also document that the act had unintended consequences. While many women accepted the ritual, a minority experienced heightened anxiety or withdrawal, some refusing to participate in other camp activities for days afterward. Officers adapted quickly, providing reassurance and structured routines to help prisoners regain equilibrium. Over time, these interventions allowed the camp to stabilize, reinforcing order without resorting to punishment, coercion, or humiliation beyond the symbolic destruction of the uniforms. Historians analyzing the event emphasize its layered significance. The uniform burn was more than a procedural necessity. It was a microcosm of societal transition. Within the camp, it demonstrated how symbols of authority could be neutralized without violence. On a broader scale, it reflected the challenges Europe faced as millions confronted the collapse of a system that had defined governance, morality, and identity for over a decade. The act of burning the uniforms foreshadowed larger processes of denazification, reintegration, and historical reckoning that would define the immediate post-war period. Numbers and records underscore the scale of the event. Camp reports indicate that hundreds of uniforms were destroyed in this single ritual, spanning multiple auxiliary services and ranks. Each garment represented an individual life, a specific role within the Nazi apparatus, and a step toward dismantling the psychological hold of totalitarian authority. The meticulous documentation of these items later provided evidence for historical research, trials, and post-war assessments, ensuring that the significance of the ritual would be preserved beyond the immediate moment. Ultimately, the aftermath of the uniform burning ritual combined practical outcomes with profound human consequences. The women were physically safe, the materials neutralized, and order maintained. Yet beneath these tangible results lay the more subtle effects: altered self-perception, dismantled hierarchies, and a tentative step toward understanding and processing participation in a fallen regime. The act had changed the camp, the prisoners, and the officers in ways that would reverberate long after the last uniform had turned to ash. Weeks and months after the uniform burning ritual, the impact on the women POWs extended far beyond the immediate confines of the camp. The act had served as a psychological pivot, but the emotional and social consequences persisted. Many struggled with a sense of dislocation. Liberation had arrived, yet it was accompanied by a profound loss of identity. Without their uniforms, the visual markers that once defined their roles, rank, and purpose were gone, leaving an unsettling void. Reintegration into post-war society proved complex. Some women returned to families and communities that had suffered under the Nazi regime, where lingering resentment and suspicion made adjustment difficult. Historians note that former auxiliaries and administrative staff often faced scrutiny, both formal and informal. The burned uniforms, recorded meticulously by Allied officers, sometimes became symbolic evidence in local and national assessments of wartime complicity. Yet for many, the psychological impact of the burn had already initiated an internal reckoning, a personal confrontation with choices, indoctrination, and survival. Contemporary accounts describe women attempting to reclaim agency in subtle ways, taking ordinary civilian clothing, performing daily tasks, and engaging cautiously with neighbors. The absence of uniforms allowed for a redefinition of identity, though it was often fraught with shame, guilt, or lingering attachment to past roles. Social dynamics shifted as well. Former hierarchies based on rank or function evaporated, and relationships were renegotiated in a world no longer governed by Nazi symbolism. The fire had not only consumed garments, it had dismantled social structures and expectations embedded within them. Long-term psychological studies suggest that symbolic acts of this kind, forced destruction of uniforms or insignia, can accelerate cognitive and emotional processing of traumatic experiences. For the women POWs, participation in the ritual acted as a forced confrontation with ideology, prompting reflection on complicity, obedience, and personal responsibility. Survivors later described a mixture of relief and residual trauma, noting that the act of relinquishing uniforms marked the beginning of a slow, often painful, journey toward self-awareness and societal reintegration. Historians also recognize the ritual's broader historical significance. By destroying the uniforms, Allied officers neutralized potential instruments of propaganda and minimized the risk of organized resistance. At the same time, they documented the event meticulously, preserving both the operational and human dimensions for future study. These records, now part of military archives, provide a rare window into the nuanced management of female POWs, highlighting the intersection of military strategy, psychology, and moral consideration in the waning months of World War II. The ashes of the uniforms remained a tangible reminder of the collapse of Nazi ideology. For the women, the fire symbolized both liberation and loss, freedom from enforced service, yet a confrontation with the choices that had led them there. For Allied officers, it confirmed the effectiveness of combining practical measures with psychological insight, and for historians, it represented a microcosm of the broader societal and ideological shifts sweeping across post-war Europe. Ultimately, the ritual's consequences extended into memory, morality, and historical narrative. It became a case study in the power of symbolism, demonstrating how controlled acts of destruction could both enforce authority and facilitate reflection. The women POWs carried these memories for decades, reminders of a moment when ideology met fire, obedience met reflection, and liberation was inseparable from loss. The fire that consumed the Nazi uniforms in that frozen POW camp was more than a ritual. It was a reckoning. In the flames, ideology met its literal and symbolic end. For the women who had worn the garments, the act marked the severing of ties to a system that had defined, constrained, and in many ways imprisoned their identities. The ash rising into the gray winter sky carried away more than fabric. It carried the weight of obedience, indoctrination, and a chapter of history that demanded acknowledgement. This moment illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare and human experience. The end of conflict is never solely measured in victories or treaties. Liberation can be intimate, quiet, and deeply personal, yet just as consequential as any battlefield triumph. The destruction of symbols, the insignia, the epaulets, the uniforms themselves, revealed the subtle power of material objects to hold allegiance and authority, and conversely, how their removal can catalyze psychological transformation. History remembers the battles, the strategies, the armies that clashed, yet it is in moments like this that the human dimension of war becomes tangible. The women's hesitation, fear, grief, and eventual acceptance demonstrate the intersection of ideology, obedience, and morality. Allied officers recognized this complexity, orchestrating an act that was simultaneously tactical, psychological, and humane, a reminder that warfare is as much about shaping minds as it is about shaping territory. In the broader sweep of history, the ritual of burning uniforms reflects the fragility of imposed authority and the resilience of the human spirit. Symbols can command. Uniforms can intimidate, but when confronted with fire and reflection, both lose their power. The women POWs, standing amid ashes, were witnesses to the collapse of a world they had once inhabited, a collapse that mirrored the transformation of Europe itself. And so, the scene closes not with the roar of battle, but with quiet introspection. The flames may have faded, but their impact endured, a testament to the complexities of liberation, the power of symbolism, and the enduring human capacity to reckon with the past, confront ideology, and reclaim autonomy in a world irrevocably changed.